July 1598. And in this part of the video I hope to bring out a little bit more of the real Elizabeth, rather than the Queen, which we've seen a lot about, the real Elizabeth. And this bit, really what we're going to have a look at now, brings out A, her selfish side, and B, her very tender side. So, July 1598, the Strand, Burleigh House, which was the residence of her chief advisor, William Cecil Lord Burleigh. Nothing remains of Burleigh House nowadays, and the earliest image I can find of it is this one from the early 18th century, and even then it was being built near, upon and encroached upon. But I've marked it off in red with the red arrow, and that shows you what remained of Burleigh House in the 18th century. But in the Tudor times it was a palatial London residence and not surrounded by all this hurly-burly. The Strand was where the very richest in society lived. But yeah, July 1598, the Strand, Burleigh House and William Cecil. Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth's greatest advisor and good friend, now aged 78, white-haired and shrunken and riddled with gout, but still working, having to be carried around on a chair, because Elizabeth, who'd relied on him so heavily for over half a century, refused to let him retire, although now he fell seriously ill. And this is where we get to see, as I said, the selfish side of Elizabeth's nature for not letting the poor man retire, but the more tender side of the real Elizabeth. Part of her not letting him retire was born of selfishness and also born of fear as well. Yeah, he's become seriously ill and he's at his house in the Strand. As he lay ailing in bed in his house on the Strand, Elizabeth would often visit him and would spoon feed him broths and cordials with her own hand, which is a very humbling and unusual gesture for a 16th century monarch. And she sent him medicines, plus wrote very affectionately to him, and these are her words. "I do entreat heaven daily for your longer life, lest myself and this realm stand in need of cordial too." And by that she meant, if he died, the greatest advisor and statesman, he was the prime minister of his age, and he was the greatest that the country had known. Even some of his enemies had to commend him for his skill as a statesman. And Elizabeth was terrified of losing such a statesman for those reasons, but also he was the last link to her youth. They'd both grown old together. So yeah, it's quite sad really, but that's what she meant by that, in need of cordial too. And she told him she wished to live no longer than she had with him, and that's a remark that made him weep. She was terrified and so distressed of losing him. As I said, he was the last link to the ruling caste and the times of her youth, all the old school having died. Burleigh died on the 4th of August 1598. A devastated Queen Elizabeth, like when Lord Robert Dudley died, shut herself into her chambers to mourn in private. Elizabeth later stated that no prince hath ever had such a counsellor. And with Burleigh gone, who we've just seen, with the nicknames, let's go back to him and focus on that. She nicknamed all her favourites. Burleigh was her spirit, as you see at the top there. And Walsingham here, who was the chief spy master, who was her lids. That was the links of her youth gone, and her greatest statesman and greatest spy master gone. And there you see Elizabeth with Burleigh and Walsingham, her spirit and her lids. And now she's basically an old and ailing woman in a young man's world with no links to her world that she knew, which is a thing that many an older person knows. But death wasn't just taking Elizabeth's friends, it was also taking her enemies. On the 4th of September, King Philip II of Spain, here, who we see, her old nemesis, died, ravaged by an illness that had reduced him to a mass of stinking sores. This is the architect of the Armada, also the man that oversaw and instructed much of the Grand Inquisitions that saw many what he and his people labelled heretics burned to death. So it seems that he came to a pretty justified end, didn't it? But it got so bad by the time he was dying that he'd given orders for his lead coffin to be laid down next to his bed, and the moment he died he was to be shrouded and sealed inside the lead coffin. Now we skip on a couple of more years. Summer 1600. Elizabeth's now 66 years old, and there was talk, even publicly, that the Queen was beginning to show her age. She wasn't riding out as much on her horse, and after a short distance of riding, she would complain about the uneasy going of her horse. And when she got back and was taken down, her legs were so benumbed that she could barely stand. When Elizabeth discovered what was being said of her, she set out on a vigorous campaign of riding out longer, plus progresses, to try and disprove the rumours. When Lord Hunsdon asked her if it was wise for one of her years to ride on horseback for so long, the infuriated Queen Elizabeth looked at him, walked away, wouldn't speak to him, and said, "Mates, to your horses quickly." And she wouldn't speak to him for several days afterwards. Elizabeth did not like any reference to her getting old, hence why she kept such a strict and rigorous lookout on the portraits that were released of her. I mean, this one we're looking at now is a copy of an original portrait, and this is Elizabeth in the early 1600s, a woman in her 60s. I mean, so you can well see what's going on. But yeah, as I say, she hated any reference to her death, the succession question. Well, don't even go there, which is why she would not name an heir until literally the very last moment, because one of her great sayings was, "More will worship the rising sun," which was King James of Scotland, "than the setting sun," which was herself. She knew she was an old woman. She knew she didn't have a great deal of time left. She was 69 years old. That was old in those days. And yeah, Elizabeth, as I say, was growing old in a young man's world. But people learned to tread carefully round the Queen, because, as I say, she hated any reference to death of any kind, not even her own death. Once, and the poor Lord Hunsdon once again, who acted as server for the Queen, when she asked him what was in the dish, he replied, "Madam, it is a coffin," which was a contemporary name for a raised pie. Raised Walden pies, or Walden was a pear. Raised Walden pies were among the Queen's favourite foods, and she was often given them as New Year's gifts. But when he said that to her, "Madam, 'tis a coffin," she looked at him and glared and went, "Be you such a fool to give a pie such a name?" So they learned to tread carefully and not mention death of anything or any kind around the Queen. It offended her and reminded her. And for a long time after Cecil's death, people couldn't even say his name because she would break down and burst into tears. So yeah, she became quite depressed after this point, did Queen Elizabeth. And that leads us on to the next part of our video, which is Endgame, really. So join me for that part. And here we see Elizabeth as an old lady, one of the few portraits that actually depicts her aging. A lot of the portraits of Queen Elizabeth as an old lady, shown as an old lady, came out after she died, because the strict regulations she kept, she would never have allowed many of the portraits to come out. But she's a lady fast approaching 70, and she is beginning to show some frailties now. But although she is an old lady becoming slightly frail, as was described at the time, and as can still be proven by this image here, she still kept a trimline girlish figure, and that was actually commented upon all her life. She kept a good figure. mostly through corsetry, and she kept a control on her diet. I think probably kept Henry VIII in mind and thought, shit, I don't want to end up like that. But this corset belonged to Queen Elizabeth I, and it was on her funeral effigy, so it would have actually belonged to her and would date from the time that she was an older lady, because this would have been needed for the funeral effigy. And this shows the trimline waist that she kept well into her old age. During the summer of 1601, Elizabeth kept herself busy. She took walks in Greenwich Park and rode her favourite horses, who were named Grey Pool and Black Walford. And she danced in public on several occasions, hoping to prove that she was not as old as some would have her. She was entertained by her nobles and watched the baiting of some bears, a bull and an ape in the Greenwich Tilt Yard, and thrilled to the antics of a French tightrope walker. At this point in time, Elizabeth's popularity with her people was flagging. Many thought her an ineffective old woman being ruled by Robert Cecil. Robert Cecil, who we see here, is the son of William Cecil Lord Burleigh, and he kind of took Burleigh's place in a way as the statesman, but never so much the affection that she had between his father and this man. I mean, she didn't know this one that long. Her and Burleigh had grown old together, but they came to an accord together, and he was a good statesman. But he's an interesting fella, this one, and quite an unfortunate man, really. I mean, really considering what age he was born into. But there's several stories about it, but basically he had certain disabilities. He was short to the point of almost being dwarf-like, and he had a hunchback and a shoulder crooked over on one side, which earned him a lot of mockery from his enemies, and the Cecils had a lot of enemies, unfortunately. And of the era, physical disabilities were often blamed on sin, either your sin or the sin of your parents. And as the Cecil faction had a lot of enemies, that was a lot of ammo for those enemies to go on. So yeah, he didn't have the greatest of times with it. And back to Elizabeth with her nicknames. She called this man's father her spirit, but this man she called her pygmy, which many people took to be a nasty jest towards him because of his disabilities. But after she died, he was speaking to someone and explained that when him and Elizabeth were once alone together in the council chamber and talking seriously, she looked at him and she went, "I mean no hurt by the name." She nicknamed people, and unfortunately this poor fella got the nickname of Pygmy. But yeah, at this point, as I say, her popularity was flagging. People thought that she was being ruled by Cecil here. Robert Cecil was never much liked by court or people, and at the time a nasty little witty rhyme was going around, which went, "Little Cecil trips up and down, he rules both court and crown." In 1602, poor weather looked as if it would bring in England's 7th bad harvest in a row. A bad harvest in those days meant famine and death. Because of this, plus a shortness of funds nationally, plus Elizabeth's advance in age, she curtailed her usual yearly progress, and instead she had days out. Visiting Sir Francis Carew at Beddington Park, Archbishop Whitgift at Croydon Palace, and staying at her own hunting lodge in the New Forest. Her moods at this time were rapidly changeable, which is a classic sign of depression, and she did become quite depressed towards the end. This is her godson, Sir John Harington. Her father was kind of a lesser favourite, but his father died young, so she looked out for this boy all his life really. But they had a bit of a sort of an off and on kind of relationship. He annoyed her a couple of times. This man, interestingly enough, was the inventor of the first flushing toilet in England, called the Jakes, and he wrote a book about it called The Metamorphosis of Ajax, and advised the Queen to have this device installed in her palace. And when she see the book, which was full of quite a lot more than things about toilets, in there were derogatory references to Leicester, Robert Dudley, whose memory she would not see sullied, so she wouldn't grant the licence to the book. Anyway, he defied her and had the book published. There was nothing legally she could do, and the book was a sellout. So, yeah, she didn't speak to him for a while. But they smoothed things over again, and he left us a lot of accounts about the court, Elizabeth, and that time. So, here are some of the words that he wrote about her. And he was writing to another courtier. And this is what he wrote about Elizabeth in 1602. She doth wax weaker since the late troubles, that's the Essex Rebellion, and the remembrance of Burleigh's death, doth oft draw tears to her goodly cheeks. She walketh out but little, but meditates much alone, and upon going up the stairs, she called for a staff, which is a walking stick, and was much wearied when walking the house. And that's where we get our first little hint of Elizabeth's rapid and growing infirmity. For some time now, Elizabeth had been very preoccupied with trying to solve her own and the country's financial difficulties. She was forced to sell off Crown lands, some jewels, and even Henry VIII's Great Seal to settle her own debts. But she didn't sell any of the 3,000 dresses that she, by this time, now owned. The harvest failures and famine, and there were angry rumblings from the people about the dragging out of a costly war with Spain, which was damaging English trade. This was probably about the most unpopular Elizabeth had ever been, with both people and Parliament, especially over the trading monopolies she had been granting to her favoured few, like she had granted the monopoly upon sweet wines to Essex. People started to get the ump with it, you know, like our politicians with their little perks and stuff and whatnot that they have. This was kind of what was going on back then, and it was the final straw for people. So she was very unpopular, unfortunately, for her at this point. But then things changed. A streak of luck came along, or the blessings of God, as they called it. The weather improved, and the harvest was saved. And that was a big, big thing back then, because, as I said, a failed harvest meant starvation and hunger for people in those days. But for Elizabeth, what really swung the balance for her in her favour was her last great parliamentary speech. And none of them knew it, but this speech would basically turn out to be her farewell speech to her people. And this speech really took her from being rapidly unpopular to being very, very, very popular. Elizabeth had the gift of the gab, and we're going to hear this great parliamentary speech now. So, here we go.
Mr. Speaker, you give me thanks, but I am more to thank you, and I charge you, thank them of the lower house from me, that I take it exceedingly grateful that the knowledge of these things have come unto me from them. For, had I not received knowledge from you, I might have fallen into the lapse of an error only for want of true information. That my grants shall be made grievances to my people, and oppressions be privileged under colour of our patents, our princely dignity shall not suffer. Yea, when I heard it, I could give no rest unto my thoughts until I had reformed it, and those abusers of my bounty shall know I will not suffer it. Of myself, I must say this. I never was any greedy, scraping grasper, nor a strict, fast-holding prince, nor yet a waster. My heart was never set upon any worldly goods, but only for my subjects' good. What you do bestow on me, I will not hoard up, but receive it to bestow on you again. Yea, mine own properties I account yours, to be expended for your good, and your eyes shall see the bestowing of it. She assured them that she didn't desire to live longer days, than that I may see your prosperity, and that is my only desire. Since I was queen, yet did I never put my pen to any grant, but that upon pretext or semblance made unto me that it was both good and beneficial to the subjects in general, though a private profit to some of my ancient servants who deserved well. If they had abused the system, she prayed, God will not lay their offence to my charge. To be a king and wear a crown is more glorious to them that see it than it is a pleasure to them that bear it. And for my own part, were it not for conscience's sake to discharge the duty that God hath laid upon me, and to maintain his glory and keep you in safety, in mine own disposition I should be willing to resign the place I hold to any other, and glad to be free of the glory with the labours. For it is not my desire to live, nor reign longer than my life and reign shall be for your good. And though you have had, and may have, many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have, any that will love you better. I was never so much enticed with the glorious name of a king, or royal authority of a queen, as delighted that God hath made me his instrument to maintain his truth and glory, and to defend this kingdom from peril, dishonour, tyranny, and oppression. I speak it to give God the praise as a testimony before you, and not to attribute anything to myself. For I, O Lord, what am I? Oh, what can I do that I should speak for any glory? God forbid. And thus concluding, she invited every delegate forward to kiss her hand, then rose from her throne and left the chamber to the sound of trumpets. Her speech, it was unanimously agreed, had never been bettered. One member of Parliament said it was worthy to have been written in gold. Moreover, her magnanimous and prompt assent to Parliament's wishes restored her flagging popularity, enshrined her in her people's affections more than ever before, and inspired the Commons to vote her an unprecedented quadruple subsidy without one dissenting voice.
Well, that was a great last speech, and it obviously worked well because they granted her a triple subsidy. So Queenie here was in the money, in the moolah. This woodcut from the time I like because it shows the Queen in the dress that she wore to open Parliament, with her auburn sceptre and a little crown. So yeah, this is a great image. This shows Elizabeth had she would have appeared at Parliament, and she wore this dress mostly to open Parliament. So yeah, one of the 3,000 dresses that she owned. And the speech was such a great moment that not only was it recorded down for posterity and us to hear, but also in this illuminated image or painting. It shows the Queen giving her address and looking not like a 67, 68-year-old woman, but like a young girl, so she would have been pleased with that one. And it shows everyone in Parliament very pleased with what she just said. So that's a little bit of the real Elizabeth and the gift of the gab that renewed her popularity with her population in her last years. And now we head on to the Endgame, I'm afraid. The declining days. Off we go. Summer 1602 would see Queen Elizabeth set out for her last progress, or what would be her last progress. They set out for the progress, but it had to be cut short and curtailed because of an outbreak of smallpox in some of the towns they were travelling near. The Queen retired to Oatlands Palace, which is what we see here, where she remained for some time. And it is here on the 7th of September that she celebrated her 69th birthday. She was observed by the Duke of Stettin walking in the gardens at Oatlands, and this is his words, as briskly as if she were 18 years old. Lord Worcester informed Lord Shrewsbury, "We are frolic here at court, with much dancing in the Privy Chamber, of country dances, before the Queen's Majesty, who is exceedingly pleased therewith." But only rarely did Elizabeth herself dance in public nowadays. She was getting old and quite frail, but her mischievous side was still very, very much there. Elizabeth was also a talented musician. She could play the lute very well, and she also played the virginals, which is like a harpsichord of a kind. Now, on to the real face of Elizabeth. This is how she's portraying herself in the early 1600s as a late 60-year-old woman, as she actually was, but this is how she's portraying herself, and she doesn't really look late 60s here, does she, bless her? What would the real Elizabeth kind of look like? I mean, this image is one we can rely on quite heavily. It's one of the few portraits that were released after the Queen's death, painted by people that were at the court and would have seen and known the Queen. So with this picture and another one we'll see in a little while, which is quite unpleasant actually, but there we are. These show what Elizabeth started to look like, and she is aging. She would not have liked these portraits. There have been a lot of portrayals of Elizabeth over the years. Some of them quite bad and some of them quite good. We know a lot about Elizabeth's personal appearance from ambassadors who would write back home to their foreign masters about the appearance of this great queen that was trying to remain a young looking beauty with a mask of youth painted on with white lead paint and goodness knows what else. But a little gist of what the real Elizabeth would have looked like as a person is from a good portrayal of a documentary I saw of a film actually, some time ago. And this is what Elizabeth kind of would have looked like towards the end of her life. The next image that we are going to see would have shown Elizabeth when she smiled or laughed, and this was commented on about her teeth, that they were very, very bad. Elizabeth was terrified of having her teeth touched or interfered with. They had dentists back then, but they had no anaesthesia and it was agonisingly painful. One of her nobles once agreed to have a tooth taken out in front of her because she was in such bad pain with her tooth, and they was trying to persuade her to have it taken out. So he had his pulled out, she then agreed to have hers pulled out, and from that moment afterwards she refused to have any more taken out, and she said she will let them rot and she would not have them pulled out, else she'll end up living on slops like King Philip of Spain, who'd lost all of his teeth. Yeah, that's a little gist of the real Elizabeth's face, kind of what she may have looked like. On the 17th of November 1602, Elizabeth celebrated her accession day at Whitehall Palace, the day that she'd come to the throne. She has now reigned for 44 years. She celebrated her accession day, and it was of course, made a big thing of, and it was celebrated. She was at Whitehall Palace. The only bit of exists now is the banqueting hall, but we're seeing some images of Whitehall Palace here, and this is where she celebrated her 44th anniversary of her coronation. And interestingly enough, Elizabeth's succession day was celebrated long into the 18th century, so good Queen Bess was well remembered for a long time after she died. And this is an image of the Great Presence Chamber at Whitehall Palace, where the Queen would have sat on her throne with a canopy of estate above her, and yeah, looked very majestic. And this is that slightly unpleasant portrait I was telling you about. It's painted after the Queen's death by an artist that would have been present at the court and known Elizabeth. And he paints this picture of the Queen with the things that she feared most: time and death. But it was in mid to late December that the Queen became seriously depressed, realising that she wouldn't win this battle against advancing age and time and death. And it was becoming obvious to everyone around her that time was running out for her. Her godson, Sir John Harington, at the court for Christmas, was shocked by the change he found in Elizabeth, and wrote to his wife, these are his words: "Our dear Queen, and my royal godmother, this state's most natural mother, doth now bear show of human infirmity, too fast for that evil which we shall gain by her death." Then he praised and gave thanks for the Queen's kindness and looking over him throughout his life. Seeing how melancholy she was, and because by this point she was barely eating anything, he tried to cheer her with some of his humorous verses. She managed a weak smile, but asked him to stop, and said to him, these are her words: "When thou dost feel creeping time at thy gate, these fooleries will please thee less. I am past such relish for such matters." In 1602, the Queen kept Christmas at Whitehall with her accustomed splendour, and her spirits seemed to rise a little bit. And here we see Whitehall again. A mask being put on for the Queen. A performance of a William Shakespeare play also put on for the Queen as part of the 12th night celebration. Just after Christmas, and remember that they had a new year, but it wasn't celebrated on the 1st of January, it was 25th of March in those days. But just after Christmas 1602, Elizabeth moved the court from Whitehall to Richmond Palace, the palace that was built by her grandfather, Henry VII. She loved Richmond. It was one of the smaller palaces that she had. It was easy to keep warm, and she often went there in the winter, and she referred to Richmond Palace as her warm winter box. Now too old and frail to ride on horseback by such a distance, she was conveyed in her litter, which is a carrying device that we're seeing here. While on the journey, a very brave and foolish Charles Howard, 1st Earl of Nottingham, who was travelling alongside the litter, dared to broach the dreaded succession question, and asked the Queen, very boldly, if she'd name her heir. And here's an interesting and guarded reply.
"My seat hath been the seat of kings, and I will have no rascal to succeed me. And who should succeed me but a king?"
And by that, Nottingham and many others around took it that she meant King James would succeed. By this time it was becoming obvious to even Elizabeth that her only feasible heir was King James. and she's on her way to Richmond and finally gives some kind of an answer to the succession question, which must have shocked everyone, because for 44 years she'd not named an heir and had liked no mentioning of the succession problem. The Queen was going to Richmond as a warm winter box, but as we'll find out, she was going there for another purpose, I think, as well. So this might be why she named an heir. But on to Richmond Palace, and not that anyone knew it at the time, but Elizabeth only has 1 month left to live, February 1602. Here we see an engraving of Richmond Palace and an image of the same. On the 6th of February, Queen Elizabeth, now suffering badly from rheumatism, made her last public appearance when she received Giovanni Scaramelli, a Venetian envoy, the first to ever be sent to England from Venice during Elizabeth's reign. Seated on a dais and surrounded by her courtiers, the Queen wore an outdated low-neck, full-skirted dress of white taffeta edged with gold and laden with pearls and jewels, and she was also wearing the Tudor Crown Imperial, a replica of which we can see here, which no longer exists, I'm afraid. She wore that on her head. She conducted the entire meeting in flawless Italian, but rebuked the Doge and his predecessors for not having acknowledged her existence for the last 45 years. She jokingly blamed it on her sex, but that was a bit of a good statesmanship, really, because the real reason was the Doge's Catholicism and Elizabeth's non-Catholicism, so she managed to smooth that one over with a little witty jest. In the middle of February 1602, Elizabeth's cousin and now closest woman friend, Catherine Howard, the Countess of Nottingham, fell ill and died at Richmond. Unusually, for a person like Elizabeth, who took after her father, who was terrified of illness and death, Elizabeth was present at the deathbed, and her grief was so severe that she ordered a state funeral for her cousin Catherine, and then Elizabeth herself sank into a deep depression from which she never recovered. At the same time, her coronation ring, which had become painfully embedded into her swollen finger, had to be sawn off, the ring, not the finger, an act which for Elizabeth symbolised the breaking of a sacred vow, the marriage of monarch to her people. She now knew that her own death wasn't far off, and wrote to King Henry IV of France, "All the fabric of my reign, little by little, is beginning to fail." Elizabeth withdrew into herself and was never seen in public again. At around this time, arrived at the court Elizabeth's cousin, Robert Carey, brother to Lady Nottingham, for whom Elizabeth was grieving so badly. Being a relative, he was admitted into the Queen's privy chamber late one Saturday night, and found her in one of her withdrawing chambers, sitting low upon her cushions. He bowed and kissed her hand, and then told her that it was his chiefest happiness to find her in safety and in health. And here is her reply.
"No, Robin, I am not well," and then discoursed with me of her indisposition, and that her heart had been sad and heavy for 10 or 12 days. And in her discourse she fetched not so few as 40 or 50 great sighs. I was grieved at the first to see her in such plight, for in all my lifetime before, I never knew her fetch a sigh but when the Queen of Scots was beheaded. The next day would be Sunday, and she gave command that the great closet should be prepared for her to go to chapel the next morning. The next day, all things being in readiness, we long expected her coming. After 11 o'clock, one of the grooms came out and bade me make ready for the private closet. She would not go to the great. There we stayed long for her coming, but at last she had cushions laid for her in the privy chamber, hard by the closet door. And there she heard service. From that day forwards, she grew worse and worse.
The main trouble with Elizabeth in her final days seems to have been swellings in the throat, probably ulcers, accompanied by a cold. By the beginning of March, a fever had developed, and she couldn't sleep or swallow easily. On the 9th of March, a courtier noted that she felt a great heat in her stomach and chest, and a continual thirst, which obliged her to continually sip on fluids to prevent the dry phlegm from choking her. Yet she remained obstinate in refusing all aid offered by her doctors and those around her. These medical issues were worsened by her depression, although when her courtiers asked her what the matter was, her calm and placid reply was, she knew of nothing in the world worthy to trouble her. Robert Cecil, who knew the Queen was dying, knew that it would fall to him, as chief adviser, statesman, to ensure King James VI of Scotland's peaceful and unchallenged succession to the English throne. In late February, he ordered the Queen's cousin, Robert Carey, to hold himself in readiness to take the news of his succession to King James of Scotland the moment the Queen ceased to breathe. On the 11th of March, 1602, the Queen rallied for a day, but then had a relapse and went downhill from rapidly thereon, but still refused to take any physic, which is their word for medicine, or see her doctors. With a flush of her old spark, she told Cecil that she knew her own constitution better than they, and was not in as much danger as they thought. She still hadn't eaten anything. She spent her days laying on the floor on her cushions, lost in deep, deep depression, and now refusing to speak to anyone. It became obvious to all around that Elizabeth had lost the will to live. As she grew worse, Cecil, going down on his knees, pleaded with her, "Madam, for the content of your people, you must go to bed." Elizabeth's terse reply was,
"Little man, the word must is not to be used to princes. If your father had lived, you durst not have said so. But ye know that I must die, and that makes thee so presumptuous."
As time went on, Elizabeth felt as if her throat was closing up, and the heat and dryness in her chest had worsened. This suggests by this point that bronchitis or pneumonia may have set in. Her cousin Nottingham also tried to persuade her to go to bed, but she told him, and these are her words, "If you were in the habit of seeing such things in your bed as I do when in mine, you would not persuade me to go there." And she added, she had a premonition that if she once lay down, she would never rise up again. One day, she had her attendants lift her into a low chair. When she discovered that she was unable to rise from it, she commanded her ladies to help her to her feet. Once up, by an extreme effort of will and a determination to defy death to the last, she remained standing for 15 hours, watched by her appalled but helpless courtiers. Monarchs, remember, could never be forced. Eventually fainting with exhaustion, she had her attendants lay her back on the cushions, and there she remained for another 4 days. By the 18th of March, her condition had deteriorated alarmingly. Hardly talking at all now, she rested with her eyes continually upon the ground, and had one crooked finger in her mouth, and it's believed that she did that with the finger so that no one could get any food, drinks or medicines down her throat. She'd now been laying there in her day clothes for nearly 3 weeks. On March the 19th she was so bad that Carey wrote to King James of Scotland stating that she wouldn't last more than 3 days. Already, he had horses placed along the Great North Road in readiness to ride at breakneck speed to Scotland to King James the moment Elizabeth died. Cecil, who'd been in secret correspondence with James for some time now, had already drafted the proclamations for Elizabeth's death and that of James's succession. Now, this is the true colours moment. Those that were loyal and faithful to the Queen stayed at the court, and those who were loyal and faithful only to themselves made post-haste to Scotland to adore the rising sun and gain his favour. On March the 21st, Nottingham, the Queen's cousin, finally persuaded her to go to bed. Archbishop Whitgift, her own chaplain, and her own chaplains were from then on in constant attendance upon the Queen, whilst her musicians played softly in the background to soothe her. The Queen was now beyond speech, but would signal with her hands and eyes. She took much comfort in the prayers being said, and as her godson Harington later wrote, would oft lift up her hands and eyes towards heaven. It seems she might have lived if she'd taken medical help. Her own doctor said that she had a constitution capable of living many more years if she had but taken a physic. That day, Nottingham and Cecil, who had Carey here, already waiting to take the news to the Queen, asked Elizabeth to name her successor, but she was beyond speech by this point. Instead, it was afterwards alleged that she used her hands to make the sign of a crown, indicating that King James should succeed her. But considering that Cecil had basically already managed James's upcoming succession, there's a lot of conjecture in that one. And basically Cecil, although he told James he would do nothing against the Queen's welfare, he'd been going behind the dying Queen's back. So, as we say, that one with the crown thing is open to conjecture. It was now known publicly that the Queen's end was not far off, and crowds of mournful people already gathered outside the palace. At 6 o'clock, feeling her strength ebbing away, Elizabeth signed for Archbishop Whitgift to pray for her. At around 10 at night, with heavy rain pattering against the window, Elizabeth fell into a deep sleep from which she never woke. She died in her sleep shortly before 3 a.m. on Thursday the 24th of March 1602. The moment Elizabeth died, a sapphire ring was taken from her finger, dropped out the window to a waiting horseman, Carey, and to make its way to Scotland and King James. He knew the moment he received that ring, he would be the rightful King of England. The death mask of Queen Elizabeth would have been, of course, taken from, unfortunately, her dead body fairly soon after she died. And because of the portraiture control that she kept, this is probably the nearest we're ever going to get to seeing what her face actually looked like. But that's the end of the life of Queen Elizabeth I. And now we'll go to Westminster Abbey to her last resting place. If I don't say thank you for watching and hope you all enjoyed it at the end of the video, you know what I just said. Join me at Westminster Abbey. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to go to the last resting place of Queen Elizabeth I and pay our respects.
Maybe we can get back generally into the church after that.
Although Mary is not remembered on the grave with a effigy, they are buried side by side. King James did that in the hope that their differences may be put aside in the other world. And there you have it. And that's the end of our story. I hope you all enjoyed the life of Queen Elizabeth I. Thank you for watching.